You ever say, oh man, it is what it is, when you're talking about some business system or any system that you're dealing with at work, and it's just a jumble of processes and information, and just there are a few people who know it all, maybe, but maybe altogether they know it all. And if they were ever to go away, which they will one day, no one will know it all. And then one day someone asks, what's the deal with this? And you just take a deep breath and say, it is what it is. Well, on today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, we're going to talk about what it is. And what is. I'm John Paulus, or am I? Okay. Yeah, on yesterday's episode, I talked about metadata. Well, on today's episode, I'm going to talk about another word that turns any of our and all of our business meetings into impromptu philosophy seminars. And that word is ontology. So let's take a trip back in time to find out when that word really had its first moment of popularity. Oh, that was good. We find ourselves in a high school in a place called Sankt Gallen in Switzerland. And one of the teachers there is Jakob Lorhat, who is originally from Germany. And he decides that he's going to write and publish a book that's called something like the 8-part guide to school curriculum. And let me give you the 8 parts because you'll be familiar with a couple of them from yesterday's episode. So the 8 parts are Latin grammar, Greek grammar, logic, astronomy, ethics, physics, and metaphysics, or what, for the first time in writing, someone calls ontology. So if you remember from yesterday's episode that originally that stuff that Aristotle was talking about that came after the stuff that was written about nature and what they called physics in ancient times. In the somebody along the way collected all of the writings that they had of Aristotle, or the lecture notes that somebody had taken, and they made them into a coherent set of books. And the book that came after the physics was called the stuff that comes after the physics. So, this is like a bunch of a kind of jumble of topics, and a lot of them related to what Aristotle himself called the first philosophy. And we talked about that yesterday, the causes of things, and the first principles of things. And in 1606, in our high school in Sankt Gallen in Switzerland, one of the teachers, Jakob Lorhat, wrote this guide and decided that what the metaphysics was about, or had learned that what the metaphysics was about, is what should be called ontology. And ontology means, it's taken from a Greek word, on, which means being. And so ontology is basically the science of being, maybe we would call it. like what is, and that idea of that of ontology having to do the science of being specifically mm, is not something that Jakob Lorhart came up with. For Lorhart, the ontology or metaphysics here had everything to do with an Aristotelian question about the knowledge of consciousness, what's intelligible. But philosophy had to go its own kind of way and make this all about questions about what is, and answers that are as equally abstract and hard to understand. So that is that is how ontology as a word came about. But there became along the possibility for various systems of organization to be called an ontology. So the being of something specifically. And that's where people in areas like information sciences and all sorts of academic disciplines came up with the idea that there could be these separate ontologies. When in philosophy, the ontology thing was really about being, categories of being, et cetera, et cetera. The rest of the world took the word and ran with it and started to use it to think about these kind of structures that are overarching. Yeah, and the rules and the categories that were beyond the specific data. It gets starting to sound like metadata, and that's not a coincidence because this these ontologies kind of are a form of metadata, or are metadata forms of ontologies. That's a question for business philosophers. So think about that one if you're in the business of philosophizing. So the ontology then is that situation I talked about in the beginning, where we have all of these systems, and how do they all interact with they all have their own way of being and operating and being in action. That's another topic that developed in the world of ontology, and that they but how do they all work together? Is there some sort of like overarching uh, system among the systems, and who knows what those systems are, and how do we figure out what those systems are? Now we're getting into really what Jakob Lorhart's idea of metaphysics was, and his idea of ontology. So in a weird way, 18 years later, we've kind of come back to St. Gallen in Switzerland in the year 606, in that high school classroom where Jakob Lorhart was doing his thing. And in a certain way, that's really fitting. And it's also really fitting that when you're trying to figure out what the deal is with all of these systems, and who knows what about it, and what happens when those people aren't here anymore, and how do we know what we know about that business intelligence that we're trying to construct, and what is that, and how do we know it? When you say it is what it is, take a moment to realize that you're doing a bit of philosophizing there, because it is what it is a question of ontology. Let's ask the cards what it is and see what their answer is. So, yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles. Cards tell us something. And it's when it comes to life, we are all Dali. So this is card number 52 in the Life's Potluck Buffet deck. And it thinks about an episode of What's My Line in January 1957. So What's My Line was a game show about people's occupations. And the mystery guest was Salvador Dali, the famously mustachioed artist. And he answered yes to questions like, are you an athlete? Do you make drawings like comic strips? Are you a writer? To the amusement of the audience and the blindfolded panelists alike. But when you think about it, the way that Dali approached that is a great way of approaching the richness of our lives. Understand how we are Dali at that moment when he was on that game show and answered those questions in such a liberated way, and take that moment and have your own moment of liberation today. Oh, and if it exists on your screen, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for listening. I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet.